Good evening, everyone. This is Informasia for 17th April 2023. I'm Patricia Yarrow, the person who is still running Informasia, and everything here is I'm to blame. Okay, we're making a lot of progress here. Tonight, we're very excited to have a longtime friend of mine and someone we all have known for a long time, Robert Morton, Dr. Robert Morton. He has recently returned from a sabbatical in Oxford doing research on yet another biography. Tonight, he is going to give us a presentation about his latest, and I can only say, please buy his book. All right, with that, Robert, would you like to begin?
Yes, I'll share my screen if I can.
Please. Okay.
Right, and I'll put it on the better view.
Full screen. Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Please.
So thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming to listen remotely. So this talk is called "Abandon All Hope, You Who Enter." It was a phrase that summarized Alcock's feelings after 3 months as the first British minister, what we would now call ambassador to Japan. Patricia asked me to talk, relate him to my other victims, other subjects of my biographies. So Alcock is the oldest of these. So he was born in 1809. And then the next is Parkes. So Parkes succeeded Alcock as minister to Japan. He was born in 1828, so he was a generation younger. And then Mitford was born in 1837, so he was what, 9 years younger than Parkes. Okay, right. So why was he so despairing? Here's a bit of context he was saying it in. He said, he wrote that the British government are keeping a consular officer, as I and many others have had melancholy experience, forever and hopelessly exiled to these remote regions to realize the last word of the inscription on the gates of Dante's Inferno, which is "Abandon all hope, you who enter." What is significant about this is that it was not in a casual note to a friend. It was written in an official dispatch. So the Foreign Secretary would have read it, everybody in the Foreign Office, the Queen. It could have been made available to MPs. It could have been published and made available to the public. So it was an extremely widely read thing. It was not the kind of letter in which a minister should have expressed his feelings so graphically. They were expected to show a little more grit, stiff upper lip in their dispatches, but he was feeling so frustrated that he did not care who knew about it. So Alcock wanted a position in Europe, but the East Asian posts were very hard to fill because they were remote, very difficult, and you were a lot less likely to return home from them. As a consequence, as Alcock put it to the Foreign Secretary, the better a public servant discharges his duty in China or Japan, the more hopelessly Her Majesty's government would hold out the hope at the end of a few years of removal and employment once more within the pall of civilization. Anybody can manage being British minister to Tuscany, for example, but in East Asia, where war could result from, as Alcock put it, any of the endless causes of collision which nearly every day brings, very special skills were required. This was brought home by the fact that when Parkes started in Japan, Britain was fighting a war in China. It had begun over a very petty matter, which involved my old friend Parkes. And this is a picture of how it actually got started. In China, in Japan, the line between being fatally weak and triggering a dispute which could become a war was terrifyingly thin. Alcock had unlikely origins for this kind of career. He was the son of a successful doctor, Thomas Alcock. It was a respectable background, but very, very lowly for someone who rose to become a minister. It brings home that China and Japan offered opportunities to talented middle-class men to rise to the top that were unthinkable in the rest of the service. As we can see, he was born in 1809 in Ealing, which was a village at the time, but is now a suburb of West London. His mother died when he was young, and his official biographer wrote that this made his childhood grey and cheerless. One, I think, very grey and cheerless thing that his father did to him was send him up to Hexham Grammar School in Northumberland. It's near the Scottish border. It was a very modest institution, which he was embarrassed at having been educated at as an adult. He returned to London at the age of 15 and became indentured to his father to study surgery. The word indenture sounds harsh, and it was indeed a very cold and formal document, giving his father a strong legal hold over him. But Rutherford was allowed to go off to Paris only a year into it, so it looks like his father trusted him to be sensible and saw that he was serious. Surgery was more advanced in France than in Britain, and it was the best place to study it. He also learned French there, which would be useful to him in his diplomatic career. He couldn't gain a good medical position in Britain and instead became a military surgeon for a British battalion fighting in a civil war in Portugal and then one in Spain. They were remarkably similar conflicts, both triggered by a girl coming to the throne and her crown being demanded by a wicked uncle. In both cases, the Queens represented constitutional government as opposed to absolutism, and so the British government supported their causes, but it didn't send any armies. So these battalions were being paid by the Portuguese and Spanish governments. You'll be pleased to hear that both Queens emerged victorious, so Alcock was on the winning side both times. Alcock did truly amazing work in Portugal and Spain, I think, and this is the phase of his career that I most admire him for. He had great physical courage. He would operate on men on the battlefield while under fire. He had great skill as a surgeon. He mixed efficiency with compassion. This was his hospital in Spain, in San Sebastian. It was converted from a monastery and it's now a museum. His approach was strikingly similar to Florence Nightingale's in that he attached huge importance to cleanliness, ventilation, nourishing food, and just being nice to the patients. This was not the norm in military hospitals at the time. The only effective way they had of dealing with injuries was amputation, but he did it with remarkable success, with the great majority of his patients surviving the experience. I agree with him when he wrote that they were the most stirring and attractive years of his life. He was lavishly rewarded with decorations by both the Portuguese and Spanish governments, although they weren't nearly so forthcoming about paying him. He received, this is Portugal's highest honor, the Order of the Tower and the Sword. Not being a modest man, he would wear them when he could. So jumping forward a little bit, at a little ceremony on taking up his first position in China, Parkes, his interpreter, wrote that Mr. Alcock came over in a very flash style. He wore no less than 6 Spanish and Portuguese orders of knighthood and chivalry. I mean, if they were all around the size of this one, it's a wonder how he could fit them onto his jacket anyway. Clearly he did. Unfortunately, this service in Portugal and Spain counted for nothing in Britain, and he received no recognition there. One of his comrades commented bitterly.
What is it? Well, as I was I returned that book to the library, so I took advantage of looking in the reference section.
Could everybody please
Maybe
mute
you can talk to me
themselves?
later. It's not urgent, is it? No, but I've got some.
Okay,
That's great.
please continue.
Yeah, so he was decidedly the proper man to head an army medical department, but he had never been in the British service and only had been in Portugal and later Spain. But in fact, he anyway had to give up his career as a surgeon because he became afflicted with rheumatism in his hands. This sounds like a low point in his life, and it really was a period of doldrums for his career. But a very bright note was his marriage on the 17th of May, 1841, his 32nd birthday, to the 28-year-old Henrietta Bacon. She was funny, artistic, and enterprising, and really the perfect wife for him. I'm very sorry I haven't been able to find a photograph of her. She knew he planned to go to China when she married him, which most British women would definitely have hesitated about. But Henry, as Alcock called her, was excited about the adventure and told him that anyway, wherever he was, she would be happy. So he made a dramatic career shift and entered the consular service. Here's an outline of his career in it and then the diplomatic service after it. So he started out in Amoy, which is down here, I hope you can see. And then he was there for just a very short time. And then he moved to this place called Fuzhou, which is a more important city. His most significant job in China, in his consular career was Shanghai. This was a very important post, followed by Guangzhou, which is written here as Canton. That was the most senior of the positions because it was the oldest position in the consular service in China, but the Shanghai job was more important. Then you'll see he became minister to Japan in 1859, followed by minister to China. I've decided I want to say lots about his time in Japan, so I have to leave China alone, apart from discussing two aspects. One is with respect to what I think was Alcock's greatest failure as a minister, and that was he never gained the cooperation of the merchants who were there. Many of them were very dodgy, but a crucial part of his job was expanding British trade with China and Japan, and he should have worked harder with them, as his successor Parkes did, rather than call them the scum of the earth, which wasn't a very good idea. This antipathy towards them started when he was in Shanghai. He wrote of being told, "You as HM's consul are bound to look to national and permanent interests. That is your business. But it is my business to make a fortune with the least possible loss of time. In 2 or 3 years at farthest, I hope to realize a fortune and get away. What can it matter to me if all Shanghai disappears afterwards in fire or flood? You must not expect men in my situation to condemn themselves to years of prolonged exile in an unhealthy climate for the benefit of posterity." So this was he included this in a book published while he was minister to Japan. It would have just been so much better if he'd left things like this out, because there were times when he needed the help of the merchants, and they gained their revenge by not giving it to him. The second thing to write about from his Shanghai years was the death of Henrietta there at the age of 40. I haven't been able to find out how she died. He mourned her deeply, writing of the aching sense of desolation around and about me. Nor through the coming vista do I see any glimpse of lightness left to cheer me on. On her gravestone was written, "Well beloved, unforgotten." We see a big change come over him after this loss. Up until her death, he was positive about being in China, but after he lost her, he never stopped trying to escape from East Asia. Unfortunately for him, the Foreign Office had other ideas, and in 1858, he was appointed Consul General to Japan, Britain's first representative to the country following the signing of the Anglo-Japanese Treaty, which opened Japan to British trade. So Alcock would be based in Edo, which of course is now Tokyo, and consulates would be opened at 3 ports. So Hakodate up in Hokkaido, which was called Ezo at the time, Kanagawa, which is between Edo and Yokohama, and Nagasaki. Some of Alcock's reluctance to go to Japan was down to the incredibly low status and salary he was being given. He was told he would have exactly the same responsibilities as Frederick Bruce, the minister to China, but would only be consul general rather than minister, and on a much lower salary. In fact, it was the same as he had been receiving as consul in Guangzhou. This was a reflection of Japan's low standing rather than Alcock's, but he took it personally. So, only 2 months after his arrival, he responded in an extraordinary way by promoting himself to minister, explaining that affairs were of a critical nature which could only be handled by a minister, adding that it was the only way open to a servant whose first desire and duty should be to secure the public ends which Her Majesty's government contemplated in sending a mission to this country. He must have held his breath after sending that, but it worked out well. His rank as minister was confirmed and his pay was raised to £2,000 a year. So still a lot less than Bruce, but it was slightly improved. Incidentally, there were ambassadors at the time, but you had to be a very big and important country to get an ambassador. So France had an ambassador, Austria did, Austria-Hungary, Russia did, but even America only got a minister. So Japan was certainly not considered to be in that league at that time. Alcock was certainly earning his money with an extraordinarily difficult series of challenges confronting him. So he had to establish diplomatic relations with Japan, enforce the terms of the 1858 treaty, get British trade started, prevent any Russian advance in East Asia, and ensure the security of British interests and punish any attacks on them. The first of these, establishing diplomatic relations, worked out surprisingly easily, with the Japanese authorities cooperating. He had an audience of the 14-year-old Shogun Iemochi and presented his credentials to him. And the Shogun ratified the treaty. So these were major gains. Admittedly, these things should have been done by the emperor, but that clearly wasn't going to happen. So they basically pretended he didn't exist, which wasn't hard as he was hidden away in Kyoto. Alcock chose the Temple of Tozenji for the legation. As you can see, I mean, it was a lovely spot. It was idyllic, really, in Takanawa, a little north of Shinagawa, overlooking Edo Bay. Indeed, he wrote later, "I felt almost doubtful whether a treat so perfect in every respect could possibly have fallen to my lot without some terrible drawback." There was indeed a terrible drawback, which we'll come to in a moment. So, the second point, enforcing the treaty. This was hard because the Japanese did not like it and looked for ways to undermine it. One effective way they did this that incensed Alcock was changing the port near Edo the British would use from Kanagawa to one further away, the village of Yokohama. Apart from the fact that it violated the treaty, he objected to its distance from Edo and the fact that access to it could be restricted as it had been made into an island by cutting a canal around it. So you can see this nice canal here. So it meant that who entered and exited could be restricted. He thought it was far too similar to the island of Dejima, which the Dutch had been confined to in Nagasaki. The merchants were perfectly happy with Yokohama. It had a good harbour, and facilities were provided by the authorities to help set themselves up there, including, very important, a huge red light area. Here it is here on the bottom left-hand part of the screen. It's now the site of Yokohama Baseball Stadium. The Foreign Secretary told Alcock that Yokohama, Kanagawa, it was not worth making a fuss over. So Alcock, in his fury, found himself isolated and just had to accept it. Yokohama grew from a village in 1858 to a city of over 100,000 people in just 10 years. As for the third of our points, trade, it went well, and Yokohama started booming. It is estimated that in 1859, exports out of Yokohama amounted to $400,000, while by 1866, they were worth 14 million. And Britain had an 80% share of this trade. However, Alcock had such poor relations with the merchants, he had little to do with this success. Adding to the antipathy built up in Shanghai was his resentment at the way they had undermined him by accepting Yokohama as the port they would operate from. Next, we come to the problem of Russia. Britain and its allies had taken 2.5 years to defeat the country in the Crimean War, which was to curb its expansion in the Turkish Empire. That war had ended in 1856, so when Alcock arrived in Japan in 1859, that trauma was very recent. The weakness of Japan, China, and Korea offered tempting possibilities to Russia. This map is in French, was the best I could find, but you can see that Russia had just annexed huge areas of territory that it had gained from China. So this bit was annexed in 1858, that part, and then this part was annexed in 1860. So it was gaining this territory that turned Russia into a Pacific power. I read recently that China wants that back, so that'll be fun. It seemed more than possible that Russia would take Hokkaido, for example, and Alcock could see no way of stopping them. As we saw, one of the British consulates was in Hakodate, so on Hokkaido, but Alcock wrote that the Russians will do just whatever they please, whether we have anybody there or not. Problem was, it wasn't because Britain didn't have enough power to stop them, but because he knew that back in London, they would see Hokkaido as not worth fighting for. The next task was ensuring the security of British interests, which was hard because there was widespread, often very violent hostility to the Western presence in Japan. And this brings us to the big drawback of Tozenji, that it was hopelessly vulnerable to attack. I mean, there were no walls, no proper doors, no proper windows. People could come in from any side. This picture is a reconstruction of the first of the assaults on it. When the intruders came, Lawrence Oliphant, so he was Alcock's number 2, this man here, he could only lay his hand on a hunting whip to defend himself and ended up with a nasty injury, losing the full use of an arm. Security, so Alcock complained to the government, and the government said, oh, we're so dreadfully sorry about this. And they said, we'll make sure it never happens again. So they posted 500 guards around the legation. But when Tozenji was attacked again a year later, these guards, they did nothing to stop the intruders entering. Alcock had to make sure these attacks were punished to deter others, but this was his only means of doing so. HMS Ringdove, which was sitting in Yokohama Harbour. Alcock constantly pleaded for more naval support, but the Royal Navy was busy fighting the war in China. And anyway, the government did not see Japan as important enough to Britain to justify sending more ships. In fact, although it looked small, the ringdove could have done a lot of damage. For example, Alcock thought he could have used it to blockade Edo Bay to prevent food shipments coming into the capital, thus starving the government into compliance with the treaty. But the Foreign Secretary absolutely refused to allow him to do anything of the kind. Alcock commented that Britain habitually, after forcing political and commercial relations on other countries, was most reluctant to resort to coercive means for the enforcement of treaties. And thus the Japanese have begun to imagine that nothing will induce any foreign power to go to war. Thus fortified, they play out their game of cross questions and crooked answers with imperturbable sang-froid and untiring vigor. Indeed, the Japanese were being pretty audacious. The youth of the shogun and the weakness of his government was giving Emperor Komei, so he was Emperor Meiji's father, a chance to flex his muscles. And unfortunately, he was rabidly anti-foreign. He told the shogun, foreigners must either be banished by force or they must be all removed to Nagasaki and Hakodate. Measures must be adopted to render it impossible for them to assert their pretensions, and if they are allowed to remain in Japan, let it appear that they are not here. There was no way that the shogun could get the foreigners out of Yokohama and Edo, but the emperor's increasing power and prestige meant he had to look like he was trying to. So the shogun's regime made very feeble efforts to try to get the foreigners out. Foreigners weren't particularly bothered about it, but Alcock was angered that it showed no respect for a treaty that had been ratified only 4 years earlier. If the Japanese couldn't get rid of the foreigners, they could make life very uncomfortable for them. The biggest day-to-day problem for Alcock was the constant stress of living with the possibility that you could be attacked at any second. As we've seen, you weren't even safe in your own bed. Ernest Sato, who worked under Alcock, wrote of breathing a sigh of relief every time he walked past the sword-bearing samurai and wasn't attacked. At the same time, you have to feel a little sorry for the shogun's regime. They were being buffeted by irreconcilable forces. The Western powers, the emperor, anti-foreign forces in Japan, rebellious domains, none of which they were strong enough to bring to heel. Unsurprisingly, Alcock was not enjoying his job very much. He wrote of seeing some tied up tortoises plying their limbs in the most futile but persevering efforts to make some progress, adding, "I confess I looked on these unhappy prisoners exiled from their native element and condemned to a life of endless effort without result, with a strong fellow feeling of sympathy." He asked for sick leave, and even though he had come back from a 2-year break, only 4 years previously, was granted it, meaning he could return to Britain in 1862. Actually, there was a solid work-related reason for him to return at that time, because it coincided with the visit of the first Japanese traveling embassy to Europe, tasked with gathering information and adjusting the existing treaties. In London, Alcock adopted a much more sympathetic tone towards Japan, telling the Foreign Secretary that while there had been very little good faith in their dealings, they had real difficulties of no ordinary kind and actual dangers to contend with, threatening the dynasty and the existence of the government, and felt utter powerlessness to answer for the future. The result was the London Protocol of 1862 and a big concession from Britain and France. The treaties had stated that further cities would be open to the West, Edo, Osaka, and Kobe in 1862 and 1863, but Britain and France agreed to defer their opening for 5 years. In return, the Japanese would strictly comply with the treaty, which, of course, they should have been doing anyway. 1862 turned out to be a very significant year for Alcock. On the 19th of June, he was knighted by the Queen, and even better, 2 weeks later, he married Lucy Lauder. She was 47 and he was 53. He'd known Lucy a long time. She'd been married to the British consulate chaplain in Shanghai, where he'd lived for 9 years. She brought 4 stepchildren to the marriage, who all gave Alcock worries and embarrassments, but she was the perfect wife for him, and going by descriptions of her was very like Henrietta, his first wife, in her bright, positive approach to life. Alcock wrote of her that she never made any difficulty in accompanying me to the ends of the earth or making her home and a happy home wherever her husband is. At the time of the marriage, her sons were off making their way in the world, but her youngest, Amy, was 14, and Alcock, who never had any of his own children, would treat her as his own daughter. When Alcock returned to Japan in 1864, he was strengthened, both personally following his marriage and professionally. The growing trade made the British government more prepared to commit resources to supporting him. But his position vis-à-vis the Japanese government had not changed much. They were playing him very cleverly. He wrote that under a flimsy veil of courtesy and goodwill, belied by 100 petty acts of annoyance, they rendered the ratified treaties null and void in effect. An opportunity for Alcock to take action to gain some respect came when Kyushu, so this is down here, the domain at the western tip of Honshu, fired on foreign vessels and was blockading the strait between Kyushu and Honshu. I can't find my cursor, but anyway, it's this strait here. So this was a clear-cut act of war. Kyushu was fighting the shogunate, which meant that the situation offered the seductive prospect of gaining the Japanese government's blessing for an attack on this one domain in a short, contained action, which would send a message to the whole nation. Even better, the Dutch, Americans, and French agreed to join in. The stars had perfectly aligned to enable a virtually risk-free strike, and they gained an easy victory against Kyushu. The trouble was that Alcock had been instructed that there must be no military action in Japan unless absolutely required by self-defense. And that specific message actually didn't reach him until it was too late. But the Foreign Secretary was angry because he thought Britain didn't need to use the strait or the inland sea for that matter. Britain just didn't use it. So what was the point? Why was this action necessary? The dread in Britain was that so soon after the end of the war against China, Alcock would be dragging them into a war against Japan. The most powerful speech on this subject was made by the Bishop of Oxford in the House of Lords. He said, "Can it be the intention of this country to reduce Japan to the miserable state of an utterly ungoverned anarchy? All the injuries that have been brought upon China must come upon Japan if you succeed in your policy. There is an eating canker upon every extension of national prosperity that is founded upon injustice. It is written and will be fulfilled. Woe unto him that buildeth his chamber on unrighteousness and his house upon wrong." Alcock was recalled. So he was told he had to return to Britain to explain himself. This was a very unusual thing, and it was the prelude to firing a minister. However, the reaction to the strike in Japan was universally positive. Finally, expats thought the minister was doing something decisive to show that the Western powers meant business. Even among the merchants, there was a consensus that he had been absolutely right to take this action. Their anxiety was that the British government showing their disapproval of it would strengthen the Japanese belief that the British would never fight to protect their interests in Japan. The Japanese government was supportive of Alcock. Norju, or senior minister, told Lord Russell, the British Foreign Secretary, "I have now learned of his intended departure from his country for his country with deep regret. As envoy extraordinary since the making of the treaty, he has acquired an extensive knowledge of the affairs in Japan and in all respects dealt with them in a proper way. His Majesty the Tycoon, so the Shogun, has therefore directed me to represent to you the desirability of his being sent back to his post in this country after he shall have terminated his affairs in England." So Russell realized that he had made a mistake and backtracked. He told Alcock, "The order given to you to return home was by no means to be understood as implying your removal from your post. On the contrary, after hearing from you your explanation of the present state of affairs in Japan, I shall wish you to return at once to Yokohama to perform in Japan such additional meritorious service as may be expected from your tried ability and long experience." Alcock got this letter when he was in Sri Lanka, and he angrily replied that there was no way he was going to be returning to miserable place of Japan. When he got to Britain, he successfully defended his action, and the feeling was that he had been unfairly treated. This left the government with the difficult task of what to do with him. They felt they couldn't send him back to East Asia after all these bitter abandon all hope complaints about being there, but nor could they dismiss him from the service. They contemplated making him minister to Greece, but the position of minister to China was vacant. It was a very difficult one to fill because, as we've discussed, it needed such very careful handling. He was much the most experienced and best qualified man they had available for it, so they decided to try to persuade him to take what would be a big promotion. At first, Alcock flatly refused, but after some very hard haggling about money and conditions, he took it. And thus, he became the most powerful British official east of India. Again, because I'm focusing on Japan, I'll leave this alone and instead talk about a couple of aspects of his time in Japan that I haven't touched on yet. First is about Alcock as a traveller. So the Royal Geographical Society, which was the most prestigious scholarly group in Britain, called him the pioneer amongst modern explorers of that empire, of Japan. He hadn't really travelled outside the treaty port limits in China, I suspect because many Chinese experts who knew far more about the country and could speak the language had, and China had been thoroughly written about. Japan, on the other hand, had only just been reopened to the West, and only diplomats could travel outside a 25-mile limit around the treaty ports. So there was an opportunity for him to do some exploring and to make a reputation for himself as the main Western authority on the country. He made a splash with his first trip, an ascent of Mount Fuji, making him the first Westerner to climb it and probably the first man of rank to do so. It's having been a taboo for any but the lowest classes to make the climb. It's what he's most remembered for in Japan today. And there's this little monument to him on the mountain. The picture on the right was probably drawn by him. He was a good artist, and it was included in one of his books, but I don't think it looks anything like the top of Mount Fuji. A much more, less memorable, but more remarkable journey Alcock took was this one. So from Nagasaki out here in the west of Japan, he went overland across Kyushu to Kokura, then crossed over to Shimonoseki, and then he sailed through the inland sea to Osaka. And then from Osaka, he took the Tokaido, the road, all the way to Edo. So rather like Patrick Carey did although Alcock had to avoid Kyoto because that would have really upset the Japanese. To the Foreign Secretary, he justified taking the time out to make this trip by saying, "I was determined to seek the means of forming my decisions on data collected in a larger and freer field than the capital afforded, and by my own personal observation, since I could place implicit trust in nothing that came from Japanese sources." He found rural Japan to be a peaceful, easygoing, gentle kind of place. Here are a couple of his pictures from the trip. I suspect he may have drawn them all. Anyway, he wrote that there was an utter absence of abject misery or destitution, such as too frequently meets the eye of the traveller in Europe and every part of the East also. War would be a frightful calamity in such a country, which no advantage to other nations could apparently justify. Not wishing to waste a good thing, he wrote a 1,000-page, 2-volume work on Japan, in which he narrated these trips along with other things he had done and discovered in his first 3 years there. It was an important book in its day, and while unbearably long-winded, it really is a very sensitive and thoughtful view of the Japan he saw. A.B. Mitford, his junior, didn't like it, writing that Alcock's weakness was the idea that he was essentially a writer. He would have been a greater man if he had never written a book about a country which he did not understand. But no Westerner fully understood Japan, and Alcock had come closer to doing so than anybody else so far. It's easy to see why Mitford was so against it. He wanted to claim the crown of Britain's #1 expert on Japan, which he basically did with his much more concise and more reader-friendly Tales of Old Japan. So he was a rival. But something that even Mitford couldn't take away from Alcock was his contribution to the understanding of Japanese arts in Europe. He adored Japan's arts and crafts, writing, "Were my friends here half as clever in business as they are in making toys, few nations in the West could compete with them." For the 1862 International Exhibition in London, Alcock gathered thousands of Japanese items, mostly everyday things, so that the British could learn about the country from them. Most of the Japanese who saw them were appalled. That embassy we mentioned earlier visited, and one of its members wrote that it was such a ramshackle assortment of artifacts I could not bear to look. But another member, Fukuzawa Yukichi, wrote that the point of holding expositions is to teach and learn from each other and to take advantage of each other's strengths. It is like trading intelligence and ideas. And it certainly wasn't Alcock's fault that the Japanese government had not contributed high quality items as those of other nations had done. However, the British loved the display. The Times thought that there was scarcely an object shown which does not give some new and special insight into the habits of this extraordinary people. One which particularly did this was catalogue entry 492, short sword of one of the party of assassins which attacked the British legation on the 5th of July, 1861. So that was one of those attacks I talked about earlier. Alcock's efforts had an influence on European artists. An example that I like is from this print by Hokusai. So if you look at the print by Hokusai is in the top left-hand corner, and you'll see this pose here of this woman sticking her arm out. An engraving of this woodcut was included in Alcock's book, and you see the woman again with her arm sticking out. And Manet used the same pose for a sketch. So probably it went from Hokusai to Manet via Alcock. So how to rate Alcock's time in Japan? You'll see this quote by Henri Cordier that he cut a mediocre figure next to Parkes, who was his successor as minister to Japan. I don't think this is fair because Parkes had huge advantages over Alcock. He had far more naval support. He had far more able staff. at the start, Alcock had nobody who spoke Japanese. And above all, Japan was much more prepared to work with Britain in Parkes's day, which it just hadn't been in Alcock's. Alcock provided Parkes with a decent foundation to build on, but looks like a lesser figure, if only because Parkes was a bigger personality. He had a larger-than-life air about him, which Alcock just didn't. But Alcock was a much more thoughtful man than Parkes, and spread knowledge about Japan in a way that Parkes couldn't have begun to. I'd say that Alcock didn't make any real mistakes when there were plenty of opportunities to do so. His poor relations with the merchants didn't make much difference in Japan. They just got on with things themselves, but they would come back to haunt him when he was minister to China. In Japan, I think he did as well as anybody could under the circumstances. He did manage to establish diplomatic relations, and he didn't start a war with them. His action against Kyushu really was very successful and put relations on a much firmer footing. Britain would not come to blows with Japan again until 1941. He couldn't do much to improve security, but his insistence that the Japanese government take it seriously did at least mean that attacks on Westerners would be investigated and punished. As a minister, it all sounds a bit unexciting. I feel that his greatest moments were when he was a military surgeon and then as a consul in Shanghai, which I didn't have time to talk about today, when he really seemed to have the Midas touch. In Japan, he just didn't, but he had a lot of difficulties to contend with. I think I'll give him a solid B+ for his time as minister there. In some ways, his greatest achievement was to make it back to Britain sound in mind and body. As he put it in 1860, Japan and China try what is in a man to an extent which can only be truly estimated on the spot. Happy the man that goes through such fires and comes out undeathed and whole. He was 62 when he retired, so as he lived to the age of 88, he had a long retirement, and it was an extremely productive one. He did all sorts of interesting and valuable things, particularly in the field of medicine. But his best retirement position was undeniably president of the Royal Geographical Society, mentioned earlier, which enabled him to rub shoulders with royalty and leading statesmen. Being minister to China and Japan hadn't been much fun, but having held those positions opened the doors to the highest level of society, even to a middle-class boy from Ealing. One observer wrote that he seldom looked better than when, wearing a broad KCB scarf across his shirt and a contented smile on his face, he accorded presidential approval to distinguished travellers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Patricia, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. My apologies. Everyone else make sure, please unmute yourself. Okay, let's go through the questions, of which there's a good number, and there was also a really good discussion about his Japanese abilities and other things. Let's see here. The first question from Peggy Canada, you already answered. Did he and his first wife, Henrietta, did they have any children?
No, actually, Charles entered the original Dante, and I was wondering if Charles might honor us with it pronounced in just the right way.
Actually, I should have put in the contraction. So it's abbandonate ogni speranza voi che entrate.
Thank you.
Okay, that was great. Let's see.
Could everybody read that at the time, do you think? I mean, the recipient of that could read it?
Well, they all put in things in foreign languages, particularly musical languages. I think the most ambitious was Greek. I mean, they would put in bits of Greek, but Alcock spoke French, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish, and I think he might have spoken a bit of German as well. They just expected a higher level of literacy and knowledge and sophistication than we do now.
And they studied classics, of course, as well.
Yeah.
Probably.
Although Alcock didn't, because he didn't have a classical education.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I asked why was there a move to prevent Russian advance at that time on slide 15, but I think you answered that later.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise there'd be just no stopping them.
Got to know more about that. Okay, David Burley asks, what happened to the residents of the temple when it was taken over? Were they just ordered to leave?
They shared it. I mean, it was a very extensive temple. And at the time, there were loads of temples in Takanawa, and they had very big land. So I think they just shared it with the priest.
Okay. Let's see, you had shown the HMS Ring Dove, and so I asked Michael Plastow, is ring dove a particular bird? I'm sorry to surprise you, Michael, with this question.
I didn't see that at all.
Oh, dear, oh, dear.
Ring dove.
Yeah, is that a bird?
Yes, it's a kind of it's a kind of pigeon. It nests on cliffs, as I recall. But
So it's a very humble name for a very humble bird for a rather small ship, I guess.
It doesn't sound very scary. Usually they like more scary names like Dauntless, and, Invincible.
The ring dove.
Yeah.
Okay, I really like it though. Julian Coliford asked, had the Japanese originally entered into the treaty willingly?
No.
Seems not.
No. So it was those dreadful Americans who started it all off, sending their black ships and coming back and saying, look, we want something from you. So no, it wasn't willing.
Okay, very interesting. So Alex Burns says, was Lucy related to John Frederick Lauder, the British legation interpreter who came to Japan in 1861?
Yes, she was his mother.
Oh, was his mother?
Hmm.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, that's interesting.
Tim Knowles asked, did Alcock make any efforts to learn the language?
Yes, he did. He did. I mean, they were fake. He had no language expertise, and what the Japanese did was the only language. They said the only language we know is Dutch, and it was this kind of 17th century version of Dutch, and so they would translate everything into Dutch, and then it would be translated into English for Alcock, and it was just made things very difficult. The foreign language that the Japanese really did know was Chinese, but the British didn't really have enough Chinese interpreters to spare. They did have Chinese interpreters, but they were working in China. So the consul in Nagasaki happened to speak Chinese, and he was able to get along fine with that.
They didn't develop any kind of pigeon like they did on the South China coast.
I'm sure they did, but
maybe
I
not.
think they probably did. I don't know about that. I don't know about that actually. But you'd expect that, wouldn't you?
Robert.
Yeah.
Don't you think? Oh, here's the. If anyone's got 1.1 million yen spare.
Yeah.
There's a copy here in Iseido at Jimbocho of the book of his Japanese grammar, but it made me think, if he wasn't that fussed about being in the Far East, and he'd been here since late 58 or 59.
2
years later he publishes this Japanese grammar as a different. Why would he bother doing that? You think he would have sort of asked someone, "Can you guys make a grammar?" But he did it him. You know, that's interesting, I think, isn't it?
No, well, couple of things to say about that. First of all, he thought it was just absolutely crucial that they had some people who spoke Japanese. They just couldn't operate without it. But he didn't actually write it himself. It was a group effort of
Right.
everyone in the legation, and also they got Japanese help with it.
Right.
So, although his name was on the front of it, it wasn't really his work.
Okay. Yeah. So he delegated it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. 1.1 million yen for the original?
Yeah, I can probably get you a bit of a discount, Patricia. if you-
Just send me a picture of the front cover.
I
That's
think if you go, I think you should see it if you go to that link.
okay. Okay, yes, right. You put a link in the chat. Thank you for doing that.
You could. Hi, you could. I've just looked at it. If you search for Alcock grammar, you'll find it. You can. There's a reproduction for 300 yen. You can also the National Diet Library will show it. You know, there are ways of getting. You know, these older things are available. Yeah, quite a few people grammars were written, of course. Much better ones by Aston, for example. And to the question about the pidgin, there is also very funny pidgin mixing in Malay words, Chinese words. There was a sort of language spoken in Yokohama, but I don't think Alcock would have been concerned with it. It's very much the merchants who needed a way of communicating with their mainly Malay and Chinese, who would be then communicating with the Japanese. And so there are some funny examples of that sort of pidgin language used.
And you can get it online.
Yeah.
I've used it with my students. It's hilarious. You really enjoy it. Just Google Yokohama pidgin or something like that.
No, it's this one.
Get
It's
quite
this
quite a bit of it.
It's,
That's the one.
exercises in the Yokohama dialect. I'll put it on the. Yeah, it's very funny. It's very funny.
Yeah, Alcock would have thought of himself as being far above anything like that. If it involved the merchants, he didn't approve of it.
Yeah.
Okay, Peter O'Connor makes a pointed remark about all this. He was a determined student of Japanese, but didn't get very far. He published 2 guides to the language, neither of them much use.
Yeah, I'd
All
agree
right.
with that.
Yeah.
He made an effort with Chinese. He made an effort with Japanese, but I think particularly with the Japanese, he was trying to set an example to his staff, and he didn't really think he would get anywhere with it, and he didn't.
Well, it sounds like a valiant effort. And thanks everybody for that information. Yes?
When was Ashton's better grammar produced? 20 years later, or almost at the same?
He's about 1880 or something, isn't it? Maybe.
It was after the Meiji Restoration, I think, anyway. Yeah.
Were they actually interested in the language culturally, or was it just instrumental?
Well, I think in the early days it was just instrumental, but Sato came on the scene around 64, I think, 1864, and he was deeply interested in it as a scholarly thing as well as a practical thing. I think Aston was. Alcott's trouble was at the start, he just had, his staff weren't very good, and they just didn't, they just didn't know what was going on.
Sorry, Peggy Aston's was 1871. I just checked.
Oh, okay.
So it was quite early too.
I was looking for that. I thought it was about 1870.
Yeah.
Okay. Oops, why is my hand up? Lower my hand. I had just a really minor question on that trip, the long trip through Japan, on going through the Tokaido. Did Alcock ride a horse or did he walk, or what?
He rode a horse, I think.
Okay.
He might have used a palanquin sometimes too, maybe.
Well, he found them unbearably uncomfortable.
No.
I think he used them as rarely as possible. So only when he was being going to see the shogun or something like that. He used it.
Okay, let's see. Michael Plastoad, how did Mizuno come to write that letter?
Well, so the Doju were like the shogun's governing council, and the Japanese just decided that they really did like the fact that Alcock had put, brought Choshu into line.
Yeah, it was basically just the Choshu thing in the end. That they didn't feel he was particularly favourable to Japan in other ways, or was he a friend, or they drinking partners? Or
no, I don't think so.
This just seems an extraordinary thing for any country to do.
Yeah, I mean, they wrote very nice things about Parkes. I think they thought that they'd had, obviously there'd been lots of run-ins with Alcock, but I think they felt that he was basically a decent person, that he certainly was trying to keep the merchants under control. He genuinely wanted to see the treaty respected. So there were huge frustrations, and there was crosswords and things like that. But Alcock was very well mannered and polite. So in person, he was certainly would have dealt with them very respectfully. So I think they thought that he was actually pretty good and better than what might come afterwards.
Maybe better than representatives of other countries, or was he favoured by comparison?
Yeah, I mean, Townsend Harris was an alcoholic. I mean, he was totally out of control. He was the American representative. I'm not too sure. I would need to look into that. But I think Alcock was a very professional person and dealt with everything very seriously. So I think they sort of appreciated that. But it was really they just didn't want to see him go after he had done something that had been so helpful to them.
Right, thank you.
Well, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Yeah, and Parkes was certainly a piece of work compared to Alcock, although they came to appreciate Parkes. I think as far as sort of British diplomats in that kind of country were concerned, Alcock was a very mild one.
What was Alcock's background of not being public school, not being an aristocrat and so on? Did that affect his relations with the Japanese authorities at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did it affect his relations with other British diplomats?
I suspect so. Queen Victoria had been opposed to his appointment as minister to China for that very reason, that it was almost unheard of for someone who wasn't an aristocrat to be made a minister, because it just was felt that aristocrats just had the bearing, they had the solidity about them, they had background.
So did Alcock have a bit of a chip on his
respect.
shoulder about this? Or?
Yeah, I think he did.
Okay, there's one more question from the chat, but Tim Knowles has a hand raised. So Tim, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I think my question got missed out. I was wondering what constituted the trade between Japan and Britain. I mean, what did Britain sell to the Japanese and vice versa?
Well, they didn't want very much from us, but silk and tea were the big items. I mean, particularly at this point, that we weren't really selling anything to the Japanese. I mean, what we could offer them was technology. That was what they wanted from us.
All right, so we paid for Japanese goods with Japanese currency amassed from other trades, I suppose. China in particular.
Yeah, I think in the early days, I think in the early days there was not an awful lot of buying from Britain, so it was still fairly small scale, and the merchants just dealt with it one by one. You know, the merchant houses, they just had their own ways of dealing with these things. But basically, they could make a lot of money by selling silk in Europe. France had this terrible blight on its silkworms, and so they really, really needed a lot silk from Asia, and I think Japan did quite well at filling that gap.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm going to read one last question from the chat, and if I haven't overlooked anyone else's questions, and I apologize, Tim. Eleanor Yamaguchi says, did the Japanese prefer Alcock to Parkes? As I understand it, Parkes was a challenging character for the Japanese, but was Alcock better appreciated despite the reluctance among the Japanese to have Western barbarians in Japan?
No, I think in Alcock's day, they obviously the letter from the Roju slightly puts the light of this, but in Alcock's day, they did tend to look at foreigners as being one thing, and you know that they were just they were interchangeable, and I suspect that changed with the bombardment of Choshu. In Parkes's case, things, you know, he really did make a much bigger impact because he was involved in the major restoration and in the recognition of the new government. So I think what I think they would have said is that in Alcock's case, they would have said, well, you know, he was okay, he was fine, we could work with him. Parkes they saw as being a greater man because he recognized the potential of the new regime and that he saw that as the future of Japan, although they got sick of him. He was there for 16 years. So the last 5 years or so, they're absolutely sick of him.
Oh my God. Okay. All right, Martin, you have a question?
And I was just interested, this is hypothetical, but if Alcock had stayed around, would he have found what happened as the Bakufu unraveled and a Tenno-centered government was established? Would he have found himself just totally sort of ethically at sea in that situation?
I wonder. I mean, probably the thing that made Park so successful was that he had such good subordinates, particularly Sato. So he was getting very good information from them. He knew far better what was going on than the other ministers. I mean, Alcock just didn't have that available to him at all. I wouldn't be surprised if Alcock would have behaved in a very similar way to Parkes in the same circumstances. They knew each other very well. They were friends. I don't think their personal style was very different. Alcock was far more gentle and conciliatory, but in terms of what they actually did, I mean, Parkes never ordered an attack on anybody, whereas Alcock did, although Parkes has the reputation for being the aggressive one. I suspect it would have probably been fairly similar. That's just a guess.
Can I just say something? What struck me about in the quotations from Alcock was the one about the general lack of poverty in Japan, comparison with Europe. And that struck me as a rather interesting and perceptive remark.
Yeah, I agree. Other people said that.
Yeah.
And Japan was very clean.
Yes.
People were very poor, very, very, very poor, but they were, you know, they bathed every day.
Yeah.
They looked decent. It was different. There was no squalor in Japan.
Yeah.
Interesting. Tim Knowles, yes?
Yeah, hello. Again, what was I'm wondering how remote was the post in Japan? I mean, how long did it take to get there, and how risky was the journey?
Well, let's see. It basically, if you went as quickly as you could, it took about 2 months. It dramatically speeded up in 1869, I think, with the opening of Suez Canal. That helped, but the big thing that helped even more was the building of the transcontinental railway across the United States. Once you had that, you could do it in about, I think, 33 or 34 days, something like that. So
it gradually became risk-free. I mean, apart from the weather and stuff like that.
It wasn't risk-free. I mean, one of the Dutch translators died when a boat capsized in a storm coming from Hokkaido. I mean, that could happen. But funnily enough, I would have thought that the seas around Japan would have been quite perilous, but they considered them to be very much safer than the seas around Britain anyway. So they in Park's time they built lighthouses, but they considered maritime safety to be actually good around the Japanese coast.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions or comments?
I just wonder, he seems to, when he was indentured, what was it? Not indentured, but he started training. Was that the word?
Yeah.
He seemed to be quite young.
That's right.
He would have, what, he was in his teens, early teens?
Yes, he was.
Would he have started doing operations then? I wonder. Maybe it's difficult to know that, but
let me see. What do I know about that?
I mean, imagine being on 14-year-old.
Yeah, the fundamental problem. I don't think he would have done operations,
no.
But the fundamental problem with medical training in Britain was it was awfully difficult to get dead bodies for anatomy. Whereas in France, any unclaimed body could be anatomized, whereas in Britain it couldn't. And the only people who could be anatomized legally were people who'd been hanged. And the judge, there were different sentences. So you could be just hanged, but if you were really bad, you'd be hanged and anatomized.
Oh.
And there were people stealing bodies to.
I know there was a trade in that, yes.
So and Alcock was actually involved in all of that. So France, it was a lot better, but I doubt whether he actually. The thing that being a surgeon and being a doctor were considered two quite different professions. Doctor was a much more high-ranking thing, but surgeons were the ones that actually did some good.
Mm-hmm.
They saved lives. He saved an awful lot of lives.
But it had a low social status.
Yes.
Yeah, so that would have affected his career. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I think so. Yeah.
Well, they worked with the barbers, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they were called Mr.
They were called Mr. and doctors were called Doctor. That's right. That's right.
Sometimes they're still called Mr., aren't they? I think.
I think that's right.
Yes.
Yes, Peggy? Can't hear you.
Alcott have siblings, brothers and sisters?
He had a sister, but I don't know anything about her. I don't even know her name. So the mother died when they were young. But yeah, he had a sister.
Hello.
Okay, Peter O'Connor, yes.
Peter?
Alcock is seen to be less significant than Parkes.
Yeah.
And his career, relatively less successful, less significant. But could it be said that simply that Japan was on a relatively low arc in its relations with the world, and therefore that Alcock's significance was simply a function of that that position. And Japan was going to come far more into the world, and therefore British envoys would be far more significant just by virtue of being representing Britain to a more significant player on the international stage.
I agree with that. Yeah, I think that's right. So the trade had really got going by Parkes's time, and they had proper naval presence. He had big guard, a legation guard, which Alcock didn't have. So he was able to make much more of a splash. The American Civil War in the 1860s helped a lot. That because America was very big, with the opening of Japan, but then afterwards it took a very much a back seat, and the Franco-Prussian War also helped. So you're knocking out, you're seeing your rivals getting knocked out. So Britain was the one that was very, very dominant. But I quite agree with you. I do think that it was more to do with the circumstances than their relative talents. That Parkes has a bigger reputation.
Thank you.
Did he, Robert? He left Japan in 62 and came back again in 64. I think you said, is that right?
Yeah.
And was that for his health, or was that because he just got married to the second wife, or a bit of both, or he was?
Well, yeah. I mean, he was constantly complaining about his health, and he was constantly going on about how he was utterly crippled for life. And, he just went on and on and on. This is a man who lived to 88 in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it was very easy for them to get medical certificates, because sympathetic doctors would just say, sympathetic doctors would write this letter, and the Foreign Office really did have to take notice of that and allow them to go home if they were, really, really sick.
Right.
I don't think that Alcock was all that sick. I mean, he goes. Well, no, I mean, he goes on and on about how dreadfully incapacitated he is by all this time in the East, and then he climbs Mount Fuji, which is was a lot harder then than it is now.
Yeah.
Well, I think Ian Ruxton has joined us.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, he had sent me a message. Several people sent me messages that they wanted to be here tonight.
But I've been working until 8 o'clock, and then I had to have supper, so that's why I'm late.
Okay.
It's very nice to see you now.
Yeah, thank you.
And yes, and Robert's cousin Jill was with us until just a couple minutes ago, but I sent her a thank you message.
Neil Jackson asked about barbarians.
I just see that. Okay.
I suppose that is it not just a translation of Kee-tah?
Ketok?
Weren't they Nambanjin? I thought they were Nambanjin.
Well, Keto is hairy person, isn't it? Which is a fairly insulting.
Yes, it's a hairy word. It's an insulting word for particularly a European gaijin.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the thing is, you can sort of understand why they thought of us as barbarians. I mean,
oh yes, why?
It was, apart from everything else, they were just a lot cleaner than us. They just had far better hygiene.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a wonder the missionaries made any headway at all originally with the Catholics, because they were, especially some of the Catholic monks or priests, they were only allowed to bath about once every 10 days or something. Which in the country of the daily bath, this must have been in the summer in Kyushu, would have been pretty awful.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't make an awful lot of headway, really, did they?
No, they didn't.
Okay, we're getting close to 8:30. So as is becoming our tradition, I would like to ask Yamanouchi Sensei if he had any particular thoughts or anything he'd like to share or whatever.
It's very kind of you. Thank you. And I have a book here of Robert
Aston,
and I just wonder whether your wonderful talk today has already been in the book form, or is it going to be in book form shortly?
Shortly.
Shortly.
So, it's been for the review process. So in press, whatever that means, it's in press. So I would say don't hold your breath. It should come eventually.
And you're also starting in on another book, right, Robert?
Oh, Conda, yeah. So with Neil. So that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Okay.
Many congratulations.
Thank you very much.
If I saw it correctly, in the picture you showed of Tozenji, was it Lawrence Oliphant, did you say? Or?
Yes, it was.
Yes. I see. And he was going to be involved in the Namamugi incident, and he perhaps Ian Ruxton might answer. He was injured. Was he killed? He was injured.
He was injured.
Seriously injured in the Namamugi incident.
Not Namamugi.
He returned to Britain quite fairly soon after the attack. He sort of lost his nerve. He had a very strange and interesting career. He became a member of parliament. He went off to America, and I think he joined some kind of religious movement.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Oliphant wasn't involved in Namamugi, right?
No.
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Thank you for answering me. And one thing about Sato, again, this is Ian Ruxton will answer.
Gosh, yes.
I think in the examinations for diplomats, there were two categories, one for diplomacy, and Sato was categorized as a translator, if I'm right, Japanese translator. And so translator was lower in position than diplomats. But Sato made such a great contribution, he was gradually promoted.
Yes, I think maybe, are you talking about the entrance to the consular service, which is back in 1861 too, isn't it? 1861, in fact. He took there were three candidacies for the consular service advertised to University College London, or at University College London. Sato took the exam and came top out of 10, I think. 10 candidates.
And that gave him the choice of whether he went to China or Japan.
That's right, yes. Although he was sent to China first willy-nilly. So
that was Alcock's thing. Alcock's thing was that Chinese was the foundation of Japanese, and you couldn't learn Japanese unless you'd learned Chinese first.
Yeah.
I mean, even as a very young man, Sato, before he thought it was ridiculous.
Yes, indeed, he did, and said so in Diplomat in Japan. Yeah.
Yes, he did. It was, but Alcock took Sato's eventual success in the Japanese language as being proof, because he said, everyone else he had around at that time had not come through that system of learning Chinese first, but Sato had. So Alcock said, this is proof that I was right all along, and it's just so unfortunate that they don't make them learn Chinese first anymore.
Yes, although Sato in Diplomat in Japan refers to how a letter arrived from Japan, which nobody could read, and this was the spur for him and one other chap whose name escapes me to be sent immediately to Japan, not to waste any more time in China.
Yeah. I mean, Alcock was desperate.
Robert,
they needed Japanese
Robert,
translators. Yeah.
sorry, I'm gonna keep going on about the Lauder connection because that I didn't know this about this Lucy Lauder. So because it was very interesting that that Lucy Lauder married Alcock, so she was his second wife, right?
Yes.
And her son is the John Frederick Lauder.
Yes.
Now he married Julia Brown, who was the daughter of Samuel Robbins Brown. So Lauder, the son, married, and apparently he got her pregnant when she was about 17. But that means Alcock's stepson was Lauder, right? And then I had it's quite interesting because a while ago, a few years ago, I found a letter that I bought written by Guido Verbeck to his brother-in-law, and it was a private letter written to him. And I'll just read for you because it's very interesting. It makes me think. It's hang on. So he wrote this letter. It's 1868. It was dated, and he writes, Mr. Brown, so this is the father of Julia, right? Remember, Mr. Brown is now in the US, and as I heard last, temporarily settled in his former place near Owasco Lake, close by Auburn, which is, I think, in New York State. I doubt whether he will be sent out again. I hope not. He is really not a good man, privately said, in parentheses, and has made the name of Christian and of the Dutch church to stink in the nostrils of all who knew him. And his wife, ! And his daughter, ! And I think, and I'm now the only one remaining of the party that left New York in May '59. That's from Verbeck. And so I think, so Alcock's son-in-law married, probably had this affair with Julia. I would wonder if that was I mean, I don't know about this either, but that wouldn't have been a good look for him either, would it? That they were sort of, there was a bit of extramarital stuff going on. And I think they got married, but because he'd got her pregnant when she was very young.
Yeah, I mean, it was a dreadful embarrassment for Alcock. So they got married. She was just about to pop when they got married. I mean,
so you knew about this, or you know all about this?
Yes,
yeah.
And the bishop was just absolutely scandalized, and he said that the sinners should leave the country immediately, along with her father. So the bishop thought that her father should leave. He was a missionary. I mean, it wasn't his fault.
Right.
Anyway, so this was terribly embarrassing for Alcock.
Oh, okay. There might be another talk there, and we can.
Scandalous moments in the authors you've written about.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Actually, the bishop leave Japan?
No, the bishop said that the sinning couple should leave. So this is Fred. He was called Frederick Lauder, and because she, as I said, I mean, the problem was that they wanted to get permission from Lucy Alcock. This was around the time that Lucy and Alcock were getting married. They were in Europe, and the sinners were in Japan. And they asked if I think they asked Lucy if it was all right for them to get married, but it took so long for the letter to get there, and then Lucy sort of ummed and ahed about it. So by the time they actually did, it was really at the last possible minute. So I think there was quite a bit of amusement in the forum.
But Fred Lauder went on. Fred Lauder had a long career, didn't he, in Yokohama? And I think
he was highly successful.
Yeah.
He worked for the Japanese government. He worked for the consular service, and they wouldn't promote him like he wanted to be. So he worked for the Japanese government, drawing up their tax code, and then he became a barrister.
That's right.
Yokohama.
Yeah.
Very successful career. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, it's getting a bit late. So does anyone have any last minute questions, or shall we call it, or at least stop the recording at this point?
I'll just say a ringdove is a kind of turtle dove.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
All right, that's wonderful. All right, well, let's give a big hand to Robert for all of this magnificent,
Thank you very much.
wonderful presentation. I feel like we're getting to know that era better and better.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, I'm going to end the recording, and we'll continue, but I'll end the recording. Good night, everybody.
Yeah, I'm going to